teaching. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Last week we talked about the first part of what seems to be a downward spiral in a succession of Parshiot in Torah. This week, actually, things get worse, which makes for very dramatic and interesting stories, but sad and depressing stories. But as I said last night, hopefully we can learn from the mistakes of others rather than repeating them ourselves. And as usual, I am relying on the wonderful wisdom and teachings of Dr. Aviva Zornberg, who looks at these stories from many points of view, mostly from psychological point of view, but also in terms of other great world literature that also explains human behavior. Shakespeare, she likes Wallace Stevens, a wonderful poet. She quotes from John Milton. She also relies heavily on the Midrash and on the Talmud. So she weaves together a beautiful tapestry, which can be intimidating to read when you open one of her books. But if you take your time, it really becomes more penetrable. You learn her vocabulary, and then you are much more welcomed on the journey that she's taking us all. So I will try to simplify some of her teachings and still try to convey the depth of what she is trying to put across to us. So this week, we've got Parshat SHELACH, which is also sometimes called Shelach Lecha, which means send or send for yourself. It's one of the most tragic and disturbing stories in all of Torah, and it's called by its shorthand, the sin of the spies. This particular sin leads to God's terrifying and depressing decree that an entire generation of Israelites will not cross over into the promised land, but instead will die in the Midbar, in the desert wilderness. So you can imagine the effect that this decree had on people. First of all, they were going to live another 40 years, knowing that they would never cross over to the land. So on the one hand, they would be depressed, sad, perhaps angry, resentful about themselves, but still hopeful for their children and grandchildren, because as part of the decree, God promised that the children would cross over. So how does this come about? Last week, we concentrated on the complainers and the tragic story that they conveyed to us. It was notable because we learned from Torah that first came the complaints, and then after that came something to complain about, which I talked about at length last week, and which I called complaints in search of a problem. So while last week, the complaining and the murmuring in the camp started with the least among them, called Asaf Suf and Erev Rav, which is translated as the rabble and as the mixed multitude. And as I explained last week, that group is traditionally thought of as people that weren't necessarily Israelites, but they left Egypt with Bnei Yisrael for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they wanted to escape slavery, or maybe just because they occupied such a low rung on the status totem pole, they wanted to try their luck in the promised land. But the important takeaway from that is that one would imagine that this group would have little or no influence on the Israelites, but what we witness is just the opposite. With their complaints, they were able to infect the rest of the people. And by the end of the Parsha, when we read about the story of Miriam and Aaron speaking against Moshe, we see that this infection goes all the way up to the top, all the way up to Lashon Hara with Miriam and Aaron. And in fact, based on one slim verse from last week's Parsha, I brought this midrash that explains what happened to Moshe after he left Egypt, probably around age 20, and during the time that had elapsed before he arrived at Midian, when we know that he was about 60 years old. So it was a fun midrash that I shared last week. But this week is a completely different story, the story of an evil report from the mouths of 10 tribal leaders. The Torah gives us information about who these leaders were. They are described as distinguished men and heads of the children of Israel. So we understand them to be people who would understandably wield great influence. Out of these 12 leaders that were sent to scout out the land, only Caleb, representing the tribe of Yehuda, and Joshua, representing the tribe of Ephraim, came back with a completely positive report. So how did it all go wrong? Well, we get some additional clues about the story of the spies from its retelling in Devarim. In fact, this is one of the opportunities that we really get to do a good comparison between what gets told in our Parsha and what gets retold in Devarim. So for example, in our Parsha, it starts off with God speaking to Moshe saying, send out for yourself, that's the SHELACH, men who will scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. You shall send one man each for his father's tribe, each one shall be a chieftain in their midst. So Moshe sent them, and they were all men of distinction, as I said, heads of the children of Israel. And then Moshe identifies the important issues that he wants them to address. He sent them to scout out the land and said, go up this way to the south and climb the mountain. You shall see what kind of land it is and the people who inhabit it. Here's his mandate. Are they strong or weak? Are they few or many? And what of the land that they inhabit? Is it good or bad? And what of the cities in which they reside? Are they in camps or in fortresses? Meaning, are they fortified cities? What are we going to face when we finally go into the land and get ready for our invasion and the ensuing battles? A couple other points in his mandate to the 12 scouts. What is the soil like? Is it fat or lean? Meaning, is it a fertile country? Is there a lot growing there? Are there trees in it or not? And then finally, he says, you shall be courageous and take from the fruit of the land, meaning bring back some samples of what grows there. So when we read this mandate, we understand that a lot of it has to do with give us an objective report of what you see. But there's one mandate that Moshe includes here, which to me seems to be the cause of the problems. And that is the land good or bad? So while they can go up and come back and say whether it's lean or fertile, whether the cities are fortified or not, whether the people are few or many, and that can be an objective determination. The idea of putting into their head that they should evaluate whether the land is good or bad, to me, is the root of much of the problem here. First of all, God had already reassured the people that the land is good. We go all the way back to Abraham, when the land was promised to Abraham. And we see that, first of all, Abraham is given a geographical description of exactly what the land is and that it's promised to the people. So we know that there is a promise that we will be able to inherit this land. Next, this promise is repeated to Yaakov. God says to Yaakov, I am the Lord, God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land upon which you are lying, to you I will give it to you and your seed. And before him, same thing with Yitzchak. God tells Yitzchak, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you, for to you and to your seed will I give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham, your father. So it's one thing if it was to be purely a reconnaissance mission, meaning determine the lay of the land and form appropriate strategies and tactics. So our sages wonder, why would Moshe include in his mandate, how is the land in which the people dwells? Is it good or is it bad? We've already been told on multiple occasions, it's a good land, it's flowing with milk and honey. And as I said, there was a covenant that was made with Abraham and then repeated with Yitzhak and Yaakov. And later on in Sefer Shemot, we'll remember during Moshe's experience at the burning bush, God tells him, I have indeed seen the affliction of my people that is in Egypt, and I have heard its outcry because of its taskmasters, for I have known of its sufferings. I shall descend to rescue Bnei Yisrael from the hand of Egypt and bring it up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So what was it about the people that could not accept the land as good? Why did they not have faith in God's promise? Why did they not trust God? So these are some of the questions that Zornberg tries to explain, and she concentrates on this idea of good. Now, as I said, most of the mandate had to do with making objective observations. Just this one question, whether the land was bad or good, became problematic. Now, Zornberg teaches that this issue of good and bad was seen as a subjective one and not an objective one. And that's where things go wrong. For Moshe's part, she explains that he had the extraordinary and singular ability to absorb God's words as truth without any personal fear or anxiety injected into the question, and without any ego or preconceived ideas about what a good land should look like. Not so with the rest of the people. In fact, our sages say that not even our prophets had a clear and unobstructed eye when it came to evaluating and absorbing God's words. So ironically, perhaps one of the failures of Moshe's leadership was that he was unable to see things through the eyes of the people. In other words, when God told Moshe that the land was good and the people would be able to go in and conquer it, he accepted God's words at face value. On the other hand, the 10 spies that went in that came back and brought a partially evil report, they were looking for an opportunity and an excuse to reject the land. And when you're looking for an opportunity and an excuse to have something align with a particular opinion that you have, we know as human beings how easy it is to rationalize. So if it was purely a reconnaissance mission, meaning to determine the lay of the land and form appropriate strategies and tactics, why then do we keep revisiting this idea of the land being good or bad? The tribal leaders saw things differently. And what they saw was projected through their fear and anxiety, their own subjective interpretation of what good means. Without ego and without any other distortion, Moshe could only see God's view, the ultimate reality. And here, reading Zornberg, I'm reminded of a beautiful passage in the Christian Bible from 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that I'm sure you're all familiar with, even though it's from the Christian Bible. The relevant part is, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. For now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I also am known. So what does this mean, and why is this relevant to what's going on here? The Israelites can only see through a glass darkly, through their subjective and occluded lenses. Their definition of good was not the same as Moshe's, nor of God's. The land was good in some respects, but bad in others. Here is where their irrational and childish fears took over. They talked of giants and a land that devours its people. These are issues in children's fairy tales. These are not rational thoughts. Their fear and anxiety took over and distorted what they saw and how they interpreted it. As a result of giving their report publicly, and as a result of the influence and power they wielded as being princes in their respective tribes, we read, quote, "The entire assembly raised up and issued its voice. The people wept that night. All the children of Israel murmured against Moshe and Aaron, and on the entire assembly said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is Hashem bringing us to this land to die by the sword? Our wives and young children will be taken captive. Is it not better for us to return to Egypt?" So we see here that the people's own words become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They falsely describe the land as a land which devours its own inhabitants. And next week in Parshat Korach, part of God's punishment of Korach and the others who take part in his rebellion is exactly that. The land opened up and swallowed him and the other rebels. Further, Zornberg points out the irrationality of wishing that they had died in Egypt or in the wilderness already. Their fear is not of death, it seems, but of anticipating their death. Apparently, part of what is considered not good by the people is this subjective apprehension of what is to come. They cannot abide the fear of the inevitable, even if they are promised victory. That is, the inevitable confrontations with the nations they will have to battle and drive out. So where were Moshe and Aaron in this while this is going on, while the 12 tribes bring back, the leaders bring back their report, and 10 of them bring back a negative report, and we know that only Joshua and Caleb spoke positively, and actually only Caleb spoke up initially to give the people a pep talk. So what did Moshe and Aaron do? Well, we read that Moshe and Aaron fell on their faces before the entire congregation of the assembly of the children of Israel. In other words, they are silent. Only Joshua and Caleb speak up, as I said, and say, the land is very, very good. And continue, if Hashem desires us, he will bring us to this land and give it, land that flows with milk and honey. But the people could not be placated, and they pelt Joshua and Caleb with stones. This reaction destroyed the morale of the rest of the people. And we know that morale can be a tenuous thing. For example, we read elsewhere in Torah that there are certain people that are exempt from service in the military. There's 3 categories of men that are exempt. A man that has just been betrothed to marriage, but hasn't had a chance to enjoy his marriage and live with his wife. A man who has built his house, but has not had the opportunity to live in it. And a man who's planted a vineyard, but hasn't reaped the wine from the vineyard, hasn't reaped the grapes from the vineyard. Those 3 sets of men are exempt from military service. Now, why would we think that they would be exempted? So logically, if we associate those 3 categories together, you can see that these are people that had high hopes for something that they had just created, a marriage, a house, a vineyard, but haven't been around yet to see it through to its conclusion and take part in the fruit of their labors. So we can imagine if they were conscripted into war, that they would be thinking of nothing else but what they're missing out at home. Now, there's an additional category of people that is also exempt, and that is the category of soldier who are so consumed by fear that their fear infects the other people in the regiment. So the first 3 categories are people who are concerned with what they're missing out at home, and therefore they can be sad and depressed and not fully committed to what's going on in the battles around them. That can also infect the morale of the people around them. And likewise, those people who are so afraid that their fear infects the other people. It's an incredible acknowledgement of human nature when we read about this, because it shows God's perfect understanding of the type of feelings that can end up infecting those around you and causing devastating problems. And here we have the same thing. The rest of Bnei Yisrael are listening to the 10 spies, but they're given such a devastating report and such a pessimistic report that it infects them immediately, and they wish that they had already died rather than face death in the future. God witnesses this and once again is extremely angry, just like God was angry last week over the complainers. What follows is God's threat to destroy the people and start over with Moshe. This time, however, in contrast with last week's Parsha, in which Moshe is mired in despair and God has to lift Moshe out of it, this time Moshe again pleads for God's mercy, making arguments in every important category. He appeals to God's ego. What will the nations think of you? Your reputation will suffer, God. Or the nations will say that God lacked the ability to bring the people into the land and therefore slaughtered them in the wilderness. So Moshe says that the nations will question God's power, God's ability. Moshe reminds God of God's 13 attributes, keying in on the attribute of forgiveness. So after this wonderful rhetorical display, Moshe's plea is successful, but God issues the terrible decree. God says, in this desert, your corpses shall fall, your entire number, all those from the age of 20 and up, who were counted because you complained against me. You shall not come into the land concerning which I raised my hand that you would settle in it, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. As for your infants, of whom you said they will be as spoils, I will bring them there, and they will come to know the land which you despised. But as for you, your corpses shall fall in this desert. Your children shall wander in the desert for 40 years and bury your defection until the last of your corpses has fallen in the desert. According to the number of days which you toured the land, 40 days, a day for each year, you will thus bear your iniquities for 40 years. Thus you will come to know my alienation. And of course, the people react even worse with despair, and they resolve to go up and try to take the land, even though they were warned that God would not be with them and there were devastating consequences. What Zornberg focuses in on at this point is that Moshe did not anticipate the people's skepticism of God's promise. Zornberg describes what can only excuse me, I just have to mute someone. So what is this skepticism about? Zornberg describes what could only be called a certain type of naivete in Moshe's blindness to seeing anything except for the purest vision that God gives him. So in other words, this wonderful singular attribute that Moshe had to absorb God's vision completely without distorting it with his own concerns ended up working against him, because he presumed that, of course, the people would see things the same way. For Moshe, there was only clear glass, not a glass darkly. And that is some of the reason why our sages say, explains why Moshe even acquiesced to this petition in the first place, to scout out the land. He cannot anticipate that things would go so wrong. So again, what happened with these 10 great men? And are there clues about them that enable us to understand this tragic turning point? Do we elect or appoint our leaders in order that they merely reflect our opinions and our emotions? Or do we want them to be smarter, more experienced, better thinkers, and hopefully infused with Ruach Elohim to guide them in making the best decisions for the people they are leading, even when those decisions are unpopular? This seems to be a story primarily about fear of the prospect of war. After the initial factual contents of the report, we come across an ominous word, ephes. And this is a Hebrew word that is translated in my Stone edition as but, elsewhere as however, but Zornberg points out that ephes is a stronger word than either of those two translations. She spends a good deal of time explaining it, saying that it really means nothing and zero, and is a negation and annihilation of everything that came before it. So while the beginning of the report recounts the positive findings of the spies, as soon as they say the word ephes, that acts as a rejection of everything that came before it, and what comes after supersedes and replaces everything good that had already been said. She concludes that all the goodness of the land that they had just relayed is ultimately irrelevant. Mass hysteria ensues. And paradoxically, as I pointed out before, the people seem to embrace the idea of certain death over the possibility of death. Zornberg says the people both fear death and wish for it, deciding to return to Egypt, the very site of death. And unfortunately, this silence of Moshe and Aaron acts to further illustrate cracks in their leadership abilities. Although the retelling in Devarim paints a completely different picture of an involved and responsive Moshe, here in our Parsha, 40 years before the speech in Devarim, Moshe cannot find the words. He has reverted to the man at the burning bush who described himself as heavy of mouth and heavy of speech. His powers of oration are gone. Perhaps Moshe and Aaron are still traumatized or feeling guilty or even worn out from the incident in last week's Parsha, culminating in Miriam's Sarat punishment for her Lashon Hara. Or perhaps they've lost faith, and some will, but they do not speak up for God or against the people, and the dam bursts open. The goodness of the land and God's promise to help them conquer it were not enough to dispel the paralyzing fear the people felt, a fear so great that it enabled them to distort their memories in favor of a corrupt narrative, and to bring back reports so filled with psychological terror that it occluded all rational thought and annihilated their faith. Zornberg sums it up well. She says, in this crisis of trust, there is a bleakness, an experience of world-consuming doubt. As the philosopher Stanley Cavell characterizes the condition of skepticism. So where does this skepticism come from? Zornberg illustrates the point by citing two midrashim, which are wonderful little stories, and I'm going to quote them here. The first one she quotes is a midrash about the selling and buying of a donkey. So the seller approaches the buyer and says, this is the donkey that I have for sale. And the buyer says, sell me this donkey of yours. But he continues on, and the buyer says, will you give it to me on trial? And the seller says, yes. The buyer says, well, can I try it on hills and mountains? And the seller says, yes. So when the buyer sees that the seller puts no obstacles in his way, he says to himself, this man is quite confident that I shall not find any defect in it. And he at once says to him, take your money. I need now put it to trial. So here we have the illustration of a man whose faith is solidified by the fact that he's allowed to check out the donkey. He's allowed to put it to a test. The sages compare this to permission that Moshe gave to the spies to go check out the land ahead of time. Meaning, if Moshe were not confident, he probably would have turned down the request. But his confidence in what God said and that the land would be good, he thought would be sufficient reassurance to the heads of the tribe, to where they would come back and say, you know, you're so willing to let us examine this, and you're so confident that we'll come back and bring back a report that exactly aligns with what you say and what God say. You know what? We believe you, we trust you, we don't have to go any farther. So that was one midrash. Now there's a second midrash that Zornberg quotes, and it's the midrash of the king who goes and finds a wife for his son, the prince. So let me quote that midrash to you. The king secures for his son a wife who is beautiful, of good parentage and rich. The king said to the son, I have secured for you a wife who is beautiful, of good parentage and rich. Yet the son said to him, let me go and see for myself. I want to go and see her. For he did not believe his father. His father was thus placed in a difficult position, and he was sorely vexed, for he said to himself, what shall I do? If I tell him I will not show her to you, he will think she is ugly. That is why you don't want to show her to me. So at last, the father said to the son, go see her, and you will know whether I have lied to you. But because you did not have faith in me, I swear that you will never see her in your own home, and that I will give her to your son instead. So the Midrash continues, similarly, the Holy One, blessed be he, assured Israel the land is good, but they had no faith, and said, let us send men before us, that they may search the land for us. And God said, if I prevent them, they will say, he does not show it to us because the land is not good. Better to let them see it. However, I take an oath that not one of them will enter the land. So we see it can cut both ways. And in fact, some of our sages fault Moshe for even giving the people the option to go in and scout out the land. The words that they bring back are a catastrophe. So here is a lesson that Rabbi Finley teaches repeatedly. The police report. Report only facts. Leave the melodrama out. Leave emotion out. Speak, do not sing the story. Speak in spare language and be scrupulously honest. An honest assessment will enable us to figure out an appropriate strategy and implement reasonable tactics. The most important ingredient for making an honest assessment is the ability to be an objective observer and relate the facts only. After assessing truthfully, then courage is needed. Of course, it takes courage to make an honest assessment because fear can take over and distort the assessment in service to the end goal of believing a lie. But courage is hard. So I wish for all of us that we have the courage to both make an honest and objective assessment of the situations that come before us, and the courage then to implement what is needed to see things through. Shabbat Shalom.